Yeah, I enjoyed reading this paper, and I've learned a whole lot. It's amazing that Nigeria is just next door, and there is not much we know about it. Actually, we know a lot here about Nigeria from a Ghanaian perspective, which is a very different story. No, I thought that paper really tells a remarkable story because, I mean, literally everything we've talked about in the past 2 days is there. You have an oil shock and agriculture collapses. I mean, collapses from what 60% to 20% of GDP in 20 years, and from 70% of the labor force to 30%. And this is an amazing phenomena, an amazing social transformation. Now, of course, if we take GDP, it is going from 60 to 20%. Now, there's a new 20% coming from oil, but still there's a new 20% somewhere else, I guess, in services, and a huge migration to cities as the population goes from 70 to 30% in rural areas, and pretty much in that period, by the late 80s, you have 50% of people in town. So it's an amazing transformation. And that's only the first move, because then we have a second move, which is that after the collapse, there's an extremely ambitious industrial policy that is put together to boost agriculture. And the paper lists all that has been done, that goes from supporting research and seeds and fertilizer subsidies and marketing boards of all sorts and public enterprises in plantations and what else you have there? 10 river basin association authorities. I mean, it's an extremely ambitious strategy with everything that we've ever heard about. And so that's another amazing story that is summarized there. And then also the failure of all that. None of this seems to work. There's lots of corruption, inefficiencies, overspending, as described by the text. And the urban push, of course, generates a huge demand for food, and it cannot be met domestically. Instead, imports triple, literally in a decade. So I mean, the movements are just amazing in this story, and that leads to that process with the shock, the oil shock in the 80s, where you've seen in the graph oil exports literally are cut in half, leads to literally the bankruptcy of this and the structural adjustment policies implemented by generals, so extremely serious, that basically destroy all these industrial policies that were put together, and without very good responses by the market for a while. But there's a second generation, I guess, adjustment in the early 2000s that gets a much better response from the various sectors, and in particular from agriculture. And you see agriculture rebounding from 20 now. Remember, in 1980 it was 20% of GDP, down from 60, doubles again to 40, and the share of the labor force goes from 30 to 40%. I'm not sure how. I guess just less migration. And agriculture seems to, in the last few years, be growing actually quite well, and be one of the drivers of growth. So really 5 chapters, oil, industrial policies, urbanization with food demand shooting up, structural adjustment, and finally some better policies now that seem to be generating some supply response. So agriculture, coming back up. Now, I think the storyline, could be tightened and made a bit more dramatic, because this is truly a story that stands out, including in the orders of magnitudes of the way things move around. And it seems to me that what could add a lot of flavor to the story is to have a better feel for for labor productivity, for levels, because we're given shares and broad growth rates, but we don't get a very good sense of what happens to labor productivity in agriculture, for example, which is one of agriculture the focus of the paper. I mean, do we end up at much higher levels than before, or not? Is not very clear. I think that dimension needs to be added. There are three broad comments one could think about. One is, why are all these movements so exaggerated? I mean, why is this such a dramatic story? I think partly it's because it's a lot of oil. Lots of oil for a poor country. I mean, it's not lots of oil per capita, actually. Right now we're talking of 2-3 million barrels a day, if I understand, so it's not humongous, but nevertheless, lots of oil, so a big shock initially, perhaps structural adjustment implemented by generals, and of course all the politics and the corruption that oil brought to the regime. I mean, after decolonization, deracialization, suddenly to have all this oil when the fortunes were in the making, when the army had such an important role, the civil war, all this, I think, contributed to exaggerating these movements. And also, I think what's amazing in these movements, the import substitution first and then the structural adjustment, is the fads of the international community. I mean, there's not a coincidence that it happens at the same time everywhere. There are some economic reasons, of course, more rents initially and then a tighter budget constraint. But the way in which these things are implemented suggests that these fads are quite strong. And some of the questions that arise is, you describe some very good industrial policy. For example, you say that the marketing board actually functioned very well, stabilized prices well, allowed farmers to invest in the long term. So why wasn't any of this retained? And now that agriculture is doing better, is there some thinking about picking back some of the successful interventions of the past? Otherwise, 20 seconds each. You don't speak much about industry, but clearly there's not much happening there. And what we're getting out of agriculture is mostly services. You describe it as part of urbanization. It'd be good to try to understand why industry is not picking up, at least refer to the existing literature. And finally, on the supply response from agriculture, or the failure of the supply response, especially in the 80s, but the success today, it would be also good to have a sense of structurally what is changing. You do describe how coming into the 70s and 80s, we had small, atomistic, poor farmers, far from road, but there must be an evolution that should explain what is happening now. What is it that's driving the current growth? There seems to be a competition by states, and that seems to be kind of a rich political environment. I mean, a bit, as I described yesterday, kind of very democratic. How is this actually supporting the renewed growth in agriculture? So again, really enjoyed it. It's a very rich paper. Thank you.